Good afternoon. Welcome to Factotum Life. Today I am in the office, and as promised, I'm going to do a video today on the 2011 Grand Caravan. I am nearing about 260,000 miles, just shy of that. And I was going to discuss how much repairs, maintenance, and cost there is to keep a vehicle operational into this 250 to 300,000 mile zone. One of the reasons that I got the idea to do this video was because over the course of multiple Valvoline Restore and Protect videos, I've received my share of comments that I am lucky to have achieved the mileage I have with that vehicle, essentially insinuating that the vehicle's unreliable and that many other people have never been able to get that type of mileage out of it. What we're going to do today is what I've done is over the course of the ownership of this vehicle, I like to keep detailed financial records personally. And so I can go through all those records and, pull up historically what I've spent on items and, help break it up. So what I've done here is I've created three columns, which is first is unscheduled repairs, denoted in red. Second would be preventative maintenance items. This would be like, air filters, wiper blades, anything that is sort of replaced with the idea that it keeps the car in good working order. And then I have scheduled maintenance, which is, maybe more of a wearable item that has gotten to the end of its life and I've decided to go ahead and replace. I do want to highlight that under the scheduled maintenance, in theory, a person could potentially, like, you could run your brakes to the point where it leads for an unscheduled repair or a breakdown. I schedule my stuff out far enough in advance where it's not a surprise and it's not a breakdown, and showing you what the differences are, at least in my world of fleet management. The vehicle ownership starts in the fall of 2014 with 72,200 miles. This vehicle was an auction buy that I bought from a GSA auction, and it was sight unseen. I did not do an inspection on it. And when I got the vehicle home, of course, it was puking oil, and it required me to replace the oil cooler. And I ended up doing, a coolant exchange in the intake gaskets. I did have to buy a set of snow tires for it and separate rims. That was my personal preference on how I switch out tires for winter. I then, had a working vehicle that essentially didn't need any maintenance or repairs for the next year. In 2016, I ended up with, it kind of had a multitude of issues here. So first was the rear evaporator started to leak, and I ended up replacing that. And that ended up being a multi-repair issue. In hindsight, it should have all been one repair, but I was trying to, I thought it was more of an evaporator issue, and the rear AC discharge line ended up corroding out to the point where a hole, went into it. So, I replaced the evaporator in the summer, and then, 4 months later, the discharge line had a leak in it. So that was one of those that should have been all together, but it wasn't. And then I have a left bank upper O2 sensor failure. That was an interesting failure in that the O2 sensor ended up sticking in the rich position. And so basically, if it was sticking in the rich position, it was detecting a lack of oxygen. And in that situation, it was pulling back fuel to the point where I ended up with a P300 misfire. It was literally running rough, and it didn't actually set a code for that, but I was never able to actually get the O2 sensor to respond. So I replaced that with a Mopar unit, and then, that fixed the problem and it was set to go. Around 100,000, I had a rear wheel bearing, and then I had another one that, in hindsight, I should have replaced them in pairs, but and those vans had problems with them. Some of them had a recall, this one did not. So that was the unfortunate part. And then we had a transmission cooler line that was leaking. It wasn't like leaving drips on the ground, but it was all oily and nasty. So I went ahead and I replaced it. Dropping down to about 125,000, I ended up with a TIPM problem. Imagine that. So there was an intermittent crank no start, and that turned out to be the fuel pump relay, which was I never was able to fully prove it, but it was a theory. And so I went ahead and I purchased a Durango recall kit, which was a bypass kit with directions on how to wire in an external relay and bypass the TIPM relay altogether. So I did that, and then it continued the work. It worked just fine. I will say one of the downfalls with doing this kit at the time, instead of just going and buying a replacement TIPM, was that the TIPM at that time, which was 2018, was significantly less money. I think it was like 250, $300. And now from Chrysler, like if I were to go buy this over the shelf out, like at the counter, it's $1,600 for a TIPM. And a reman aftermarket, like through Dorman, is showing at like $900 with a $300 core. So, you turn your old one back in and the net cost would be about $600 just for the part. And that seems to be sort of the line, which is about $500 for a rebuilt TIPM aftermarket. Maybe I should have replaced it at that time. I don't know. We'll get back into the TIPM here in a minute. Some of the basic stuff here. We had tire issues, brakes. Early on when I had the van was going through pads and rotors a lot. What I ended up doing was replacing the calipers and the brake hoses, and eventually I got to the point where now the pads, I can get decent mileage out of pads. So somewhere along there, something wasn't right. But you'll see a lot of brake work kind of early on, categorized as scheduled maintenance. And then preventative maintenance was, just basic, like the ignition coils, or ignition plugs, coil boots, water pump, that sort of thing. It wasn't leaking. It didn't have a failure. I was just doing it based on the mileage at that time. Keep the car reliable. At 141,000 miles here, I had a exhaust crossover flex pipe that started to rattle going down the freeway. It would only rattle at 65 miles an hour. It wasn't loud, but it was a jingling metallic rattle, and it drove me crazy. So I went ahead and I replaced it with a Walker replacement pipe. And I just wanted to highlight that later on, that Walker pipe, I think I made it about 65,000 miles before that actually developed a hole inside of the pipe and rusted out. And I replaced it with an AP pipe. Now, the Walker pipe had an issue in the sense that it had crunchy bends, whereas the AP pipe had mandrel bends. And the mandrel bends are nice and smooth and flowing, where the Walker bends are crunchy. There was a noticeable difference in power, and that power loss, in my opinion, occurred more from, like 35 to 60, where you would hit the gas and it felt like you really had to get into the gas to get it to go, where the mandrel bends, like it flows nice and the power is smooth and it's there. So if you ever have to replace that pipe, just keep in mind those crunchy replacement pipes, potentially a power loss with that. At 150,000 miles, I had a check engine light came on, and the engine wasn't achieving temperature that it was supposed to. And so I replaced a thermostat that was stuck open. While I was at the dealer getting a replacement part, the parts person told me I had an open recall. So I scheduled it right there, then and there, got the part ordered. And when I went and dropped the vehicle off, I've been having problems with the HVAC inside the car. On the passenger side, the heat would stick. So, like, let's say you jump into the car, both zones, you turn on hot, and then, an hour later into your trip, you're too hot, so you turn the temperature down. Well, the passenger side zone would be stuck in the hot position the whole trip. It's pretty miserable. And there was a TSB on it where they, you could update this, basically update the module. I think they also maybe recommended you replace the actual actuator, but I could get my hand up there and physically force the actuator out of its position. And the reflash was basically just to not overextend it. And so when I took it into the dealership, classic, I told them what was going on, or I told them what I wanted done, gave them the name of the update, and then they wanted to know why I wanted to do that. And they, told me that it wasn't going to fix that problem. I politely or disagreed and said, I need you to reflash it. Here's my money, reflash it. They reflashed it. I never had a problem since. And, obviously it's been over 100,000 miles. And then the power steering reservoir, that could maybe be considered maintenance, but at the time I was having some starvation sounds from the power steering pump. In the reservoir, the base of it had there was a lot of crap in it, gunk, and a lot of fines built up on the screen of it. And so at that time, I just opted to replace the reservoir with a brand new one and flushed out the system, and it was good to go. And then so then we did the rear calipers, front calipers, pads, and rotors at this juncture, which was about 157,000 miles. And now we're getting into, so at 160,000 here, or 157,000, I had a spring break, and this was on the driver's side. The spring just broke, and the van was kind of leaning, and it drove horrible, and it happened in the driveway, so it wasn't a big deal. Like, wasn't left me stranded. Part of this has to do with the environment that I operated the van in was just absolutely horrible. Gravel roads, salt, snow for 6 months out of the year. I don't know if I necessarily blame Chrysler for it, although it's once you start getting into that 150,000 miles, you're kind of on borrowed time, in my opinion, with suspension parts. And so the unfortunate part with that was this was October of 2020, and of course the springs were on back order, and I couldn't get them at the time, so I ended up going with loaded struts aftermarket, which we'll talk about here in a minute, because it led to more work and more money, and there was a cost to it. But the left lower control arm was replaced because a ball joint was loose. I opted to just replace it instead of pressing in a new ball joint. And then let's see here, transmission range switch. That was a intermittent no crank, no start, where I would have to jiggle the shifter to get it to work. So that was, it acted up a few times, but never left us stranded. And then I just scheduled it, got it replaced. And when I say schedule, I mean I ordered the part and did it myself. Battery based on age, that's just the age of the battery. I just went ahead and replaced it. And then let's go down here. The heat shields are now dropping down. So I resecured the heat shields with fender washers. New alternator, not reman. So this right here is the start of when I bought another property where I was anticipating I was going to be driving a lot. And I think that year I ended up putting on almost 35,000 miles. Let's take a look here. 2 of 22, and then we go down to 2 of 23, so 199. Okay, so it wasn't quite that bad, but it was like 26,000 miles I put on. And the alternator itself was, it was working, but usually I generally replace them around 200 to 250. It was a little rough, like the bearing wise. And so I just went ahead and I replaced it. And it was a new one from Chrysler, wasn't a reman. I generally don't have good luck with remans. So I spent $600 or 550 on a brand new one. And that one is still in the car right now. So at shortly after that, about one set, well, it was around the same time, the strut that I had put in the van, um, the mounts were thumping. So I replaced the mounts with Chrysler mounts, redid everything. It seemed to fix the problem for a little bit, but in hindsight, that's where right here is where I should have just ordered factory springs, factory mounts, and put it all back together and been done with it. So, and then here we are back down here. We're doing spark plugs, coils. I replaced the coils because at 200,000 miles, they're getting, in my mind, it wasn't worth the risk. And so now I have a couple coils that I keep in the car from the old ones, but that was the main driver of that. It was just based on mileage. Sliding door lock actuator on the driver's side quit working. That was actually kind of a dangerous situation because it would lock the kids in the car, or whoever was in the car would sometimes lock and then it wouldn't unlock and you couldn't physically move it because for whatever reason it had kind of locked up. And I kept the pliers in the car where I would take the bezel off around the handle and physically force it into whatever position it needed to go, like lock it or unlock it. So I went ahead and that was a horrible job. I mean, it's just not, I don't know how they do all that in the factory, but it was not easy, not fun. So the replacement lock actuator, for whatever reason, is working fine now. That's a Dorman part. So around what do we got here? 202. The blower motor was making a lot of racket and the right front wheel bearing was humming. So both those got replaced. Right here at 202, I have the oil filter housing. That's a brand new Dorman aluminum unit. And the one that so at 72,000 miles, I had replaced the oil filter housing with a Chrysler unit. And then this one, the button, there was a bypass button that flew off. And so in my mind, if the plastic is already becoming brittle enough where things are coming apart, I'm probably not too far behind with some type of other strange failure. So I just preemptively bought a Dorman unit, which was aluminum, and they were on back order for a little bit. And so, I was keeping an eye on it, but I ended up getting my hands on one and replaced it. And it's been good ever since, knock on wood, I guess. And then at 208,000 miles, I was tired of the springs. The springs felt like a second generation minivan from like a 92 or 93 Grand Caravan. It was really floaty. I just did not like the way it drove. And so I ordered up factory springs, and I think it took 3 weeks to get them in, but I finally got them in and ended up just replacing the struts with KYB struts again. So a second set of them because I was going through all that work. So I had factory springs, I had factory upper strut mounts, and then KYB struts. And it's been fine ever since. The heater hose Y connections, those are plastic. I preemptively replaced them with aluminum ones. again, the same kind of thinking with the Dorman, the plastic, what plastic parts are brittle and are going to start crumbling. Um, so that was what I did there. And this is the third crossover pipe. So as I had said, I had replaced the first one with a um, the Walker, and then this one is an AP. I've been happy with the AP and how it, the service on it. And then let's see, we get down to 220,000. The power steering pump started to leak, and so I ordered a new one, and that was an ASIN part, and it was like they literally just plucked it off the factory line, or they had a bunch left over because it was a brand new pump. It was Toyota, like Toyoda, and it had the aluminum mounting bracket on it. Like it was all set to go. It was the pulley, the bracket, and the pump itself. It was brand new. It was cost effective too. I think it was only like $110. And so I just bolted all that up and replaced the pressure line underneath the car preemptively. And it's been good. Then the right around 220, I had a PO3B intermittently in cold. And so I ended up cleaning the transmission shift solenoid contacts, which worked for a little bit. I think I got about 35,000 miles or 30,000 before it occurred again. And then that second time, I ended up buying a kit where it came with the new contactor seals and O-rings, and basically allowed me to rebuild the soft kit wise of the solenoid pack assembly, and then it had a sort of a chair that would prevent the top plastic piece from flexing. And unfortunately, I put that kit in, and one of the O-rings, I didn't realize it until later on when I removed it again, but one of the O-rings was sitting inside this rubber cup, and it prevented the operation. So instead of a PO83B, I got like another shift solenoid air once it warmed up. And at that point, then I just went and replaced it. And so that was an error on my part. But at 228 here, my new caliper on the driver's side ended up popping a seal. And it wasn't bad enough where I had to like tow it, but it was leaking, and so I had to replace that. And then the evaporator line started leaking again. So the evaporator, the first time I had created a drop down kind of a mud flap for it where it would protect it a little better from the rear wheel kick up, because it's fully exposed to salt, mud, water, whatever you're kicking up, and then it corrodes from essentially the outside in, and it's the connection, and then you can't get the connection apart, or it's very difficult, and then you just have to replace it all because it's a ball of rust or a ball of corrosion. And so this last time when I replaced it, what I ended up doing was I used great stuff to fully encase the all the connections and the lines, and then I left a hole in the middle so the condensation can drain out, and we'll see how it still works, but we'll see how it works long term. And then we trailing arm bushings are starting to fail now, so we ended up doing that. The front engine mount was failed. These are all rubber seals now. We're getting into the age and timing here where a lot of the rubber stuff is starting to break down. Not like costly items, but takes time to replace. And then here at 239,000, I preemptively went ahead and did a bunch of work to it, water pump, thermostat. There was an upgraded aluminum housing for the water pump that it kind of connects to, or the thermostat. where it's instead of being plastic. And I did some hoses and the belt. Unfortunately, the water pump at that time, there wasn't an Asen water pump, and I didn't want to pay for the $300 Mopar water pump. And the Daco water pump ended up being a very poor choice. I was not able to get it to seal. It would be sealed for maybe 1,500 miles, and then all of a sudden it would start leaking. And eventually, an Asen water pump was available. I was able to buy one, and so I ended up replacing the Daco water pump with that Asen water pump, and that solved all the problems. But I ended up going in there twice trying to reseal it, and the third time replaced it with an entirely different pump. So that was frustrating. And finally here, so this would be last winter, I had to replace an exhaust crossover gasket that was leaking, resealed the water pump. I came out to start the van after getting back from a trip. So it was like the next day, drove it to the post office, came back, went to pick the kids up, and the van was a crank no start. And the fuel pump had just died on it. And the irony with this is that I was like, oh, it's starting to sound kind of noisy. I'm going to go ahead and replace it. It beat me to it. So in hindsight, I had a Dodge Stratus that ended up making it almost 300,000 miles on the original fuel pump. And I tend to not run my fuel level real low. And so I kind of was like, 250-ish, planning on replacing it. But in hindsight now, I don't know, like it might be any hint of noise or, maybe around 200,000 miles, it might just be plan on replacing that pump. Got the pump in, got it done. Check engine light was on. I pulled up codes, and the right bank intake cam actuator, I had a code for it. And I ended up doing a resistance check electrically on there's 4 cam actuator, and the one that was bad, which was the rear head closest to the valley, had like 100 ohms electrically on it, where all the other ones were like 1 to 2 ohms. So that came from Chrysler. That was like $90 part, and we just swapped that out quick, and problem was solved. Not too long after that, the shift solenoid started acting up again, and at the time I didn't realize what was going on, but I was done screwing around, so I bought a Chrysler reman unit. They were on back order for a long time, and so I think that was part of my hesitation on, I didn't want to just throw anyone in. And so I was like, well, I'll go ahead and clean contacts up, that sort of thing. So in this situation, I went ahead and replaced it. It was like $230. Got it through Rock Auto. It was kind of a no-brainer. Daco water pump. The issue with the Daco was that the actual thickness of the housing of the aluminum was narrower, so the seal didn't sit correctly on it. Whereas the Asen and the factory, I think the Asen is the factory, had a nice wide surface area where the seal, even if it was slightly off or it moved, there was no way that it was coming off there. And so that was the main issue. It was just the Daco was like a casting issue. Trailing arm bushing, that was probably more my fault. It ended up blowing out, where the door sounded like it was rattling all the time. And I ended up finding, I think it didn't get pressed in enough so that it was putting some side torsional torque on it, and then it ripped. So I got that replaced, and it's working fine now. And then I had a intermittent no crank, or I shouldn't say, yeah, it was an intermittent no crank when it was hot, and I just went ahead and replaced the starter. That probably ended up being more of a problem with the TIPM, because I ended up removing the TIPM just for a inspection of all the connections and stuff. And the green connector closest to the fender had a lot of green corrosion crusties on it. And so I made a video on it. I don't know if I'm going to post it but I went ahead and I went in there and cleaned everything, had the board out and cleaned it with alcohol and got it all got all the pins cleaned up and put dielectric grease on everything and put it back together, and it seems to be working fine. So that's where we are right now. I'm at 258,943 miles, and all in all, this includes, I didn't have oil changes on here because I do keep track of mileage, but it wasn't, I didn't feel like it was relevant for this discussion. But all in all, I've spent about $14,000 or $13,873 on maintenance, unscheduled repairs, and preventative maintenance. So it'd be, everything: tires, brakes, oil changes, transmission services, that sort of thing, to keep this car on the road for the last 12 years. So that is sort of a rundown on what it takes what I've done to keep this car running. Right now, we're still using it, obviously, and it's looking ugly, but I would like to get closer to 300,000 miles on it before I replace it. And the longer I drive it, the more it's just money in my bank. So I'll just kind of continue to drive it, and as long as it's safe and reliable. And reliable is kind of that's a perception issue, in my opinion. There's people where, they get out of warranty, it's not reliable. So it's all what you're willing to put up with. And thanks for watching. If you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing to the channel.